JRPGs have given us some of the most emotional stories, unforgettable characters, and legendary adventures of all time. But for every Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VII, there's a game so broken, so misguided, or so downright boring that makes you question why you even love the genre in the first place. Today, we're diving into 10 of the absolute worst JRPGs ever made. From those just awful games to ones that made you question why. However, before we get started, if you love talking about all kinds of JRPGs, even the awful ones, why not come along for the journey and hit that subscribe button? With that being said, some of these are going to hurt, so let's jump right into 10 of the worst JRPGs ever conceived. Honestly, I don't think there's a better game to start off this list. It's legendary in JRPG circles, but for all of the wrong reasons. Chaos Wars at face value. It seemed like it would be the perfect mix. A strategy RPG that pulled together characters from several popular series, such as Shadow Hearts, Growlancer, Gungrave, and even Spectral Souls. It sounded like the crossover that everyone wanted to play. I remember when I first heard about it, I was incredibly excited. At the time, crossovers were uncommon, and seeing these characters interact seemed like a genius idea. Maybe have the characters explore each other's worlds, and you could build that dream party. I was hyped. However, it didn't turn out how I expected, and it didn't exactly help that it wasn't sold in Canada. I had to play it through other means. What I most remember, and what Chaos Wars is most infamous for today, is its English dub. It's one of those it's so bad, it's good situations. The voices don't just sound awkward, they sound almost like they pulled a bunch of random people off the street with the instructions, here's your script, make it sound as awful as humanly possible. I am not exaggerating this. The localization team literally used family members of staff to voice characters. It's the kind of decision that turns a game into unintentional comedy. And while it makes for funny YouTube clips now, at the time it completely undercut whatever seriousness the story was intending to have.
Now I think I've got my head around this different dimensions business, but how do I get back to Tokyo?
What's Tokyo?
But honestly, even without the voice acting, Chaos Wars was already pretty terrible. So that terrible voice acting, as bad as it is, actually is what saves the game and makes it worth playing. The strategy RPG mechanics were sluggish and lacked the kind of balance you'd expect from the genre. The movement is awful. The battles take way longer than they need to, and the maps themselves are just boring. And probably the worst aspect for a crossover game. You would think the characters would actually interact in interesting ways, but instead of celebrating their unique worlds and histories, they're just there sharing the same bland dialogue. Chaos Wars completely misses the point of what a crossover is. And that's kind of why Chaos Wars is more remembered as a hilarious mistake. The concept was fantastic. The execution, however, it was awful. It proves that you could have all the ingredients to make a perfect game, but if you cut corners, your game will be nothing but a joke. You're better off just watching some voice acting compilations because honestly, that's the best part of the game. Now, while Chaos Wars was unintentionally funny, though I'm not convinced of that exactly, then Shadow Madness was remembered for being, well, Shadow Madness's Shadow Madness. Released in 1999 for the PlayStation, and more recently, it was released on Steam. This was one of many JRPGs trying to ride the massive wave of Final Fantasy VII's success. Unfortunately, it seemed more of a clone right down to the character models. At first glance, it looked like a darker, more mature RPG with those pre-rendered backgrounds, polygonal characters, and a plot about a mysterious plague that turned people to stone. It had a good premise, but once you start playing it, you realize just how terrible the game actually is. Those visuals were rough, even for the time. It has that Lego Final Fantasy VII style graphics, but the pre-rendered backdrops looked muddy. The character models were blocky, and the overall presentation felt like a Squaresoft game that you bought off of Wish or Temu. And the writing, well, at least you tried. It's like they tried to be insightful, but it just felt incredibly amateurish in budget. You get the sense the team had ambition, but they seemingly hired someone from a high school English class, and that's overselling it. That writing was absolutely terrible. Gameplay didn't do the game any favors either. I remember when I first got the opportunity to play this, I rented the game thinking the box art looked neat. Maybe it's a pirate JRPG. Oh, I was so wrong. The battle system is sluggish, the menus are awful, with a different button for equip, item, and magic. It feels incredibly clunky, even just navigating the world feels stiff and frustrating. There's no real sense of flow. The pacing drags and it becomes hard to stay invested. It's one of those experiences where you can feel the potential buried somewhere in there, but the execution just makes everything feel exhausting. However, the lockpick system was kind of neat, but even that wore out its welcome pretty quickly. Though what I did find interesting is that Shadow Madness was developed by Graveyard. Not Graveyard, Graveyard with a C. A small studio formed by ex-Squaresoft employees. So you'd think that having a studio formed by developers of such a legendary company would work. But it almost feels like they were trying too hard to be Squaresoft version 2. Instead of actually making something original, Shadow Madness ended up as a terrible example of how difficult it was to really replicate Final Fantasy's success. And in that sense, it's an important part of JRPG history. Not because it's good. God, not at all because it's good. But because it shows what the industry looked like in the late 90s when Squaresoft ruled the JRPG world. Today, Shadow Madness is mostly remembered as an absolutely awful game. It's not unplayable, but it's pretty close. And if you're revisiting it out of nostalgia or curiosity, you'll probably walk away thinking the same thing players did in 1999. This is the worst piece of garbage I have ever played. When it comes to long-running JRPG series, few have been as consistently reliable as the Tales of franchise. I've been a fan for as long as I can remember. I started with Eternia, and from then on, I fell in love with the series, and I've played every game released, even the Japan-only mainline and spin-off games, from Symphonia to Vesperia to Arise. The series has built a reputation for fast-paced combat, unique and exciting casts, and silly engaging stories. But in 2006, Bandai Namco released a game that was so bad that it split the series into two categories: Mothership, or main titles, and Escort titles, which were lower budget side games. Tales of the Tempest was so poorly received that it was eventually stripped of its Mothership status and reclassified as a mere Escort title. That alone should tell you just how awful it was. On paper, Tempest should have been so much better than it was. It was the first Tales game on the Nintendo DS, which at the time, this was a massive deal. A portable Tales adventure with that signature battle system and anime storytelling, I was incredibly excited for it. In fact, I actually imported the game, but the reality, Tales of the Tempest was something else. The game felt rushed and incomplete. The dungeons were very boring and pathetic. Towns lacked personality and detail. Even the story, usually a high point for the series, felt like an afterthought. Literally nothing stood out. The characters had the opportunity to shine, but cutscenes were over before they even really began. The combat, the main draw for the franchise, was perhaps the biggest disappointment. Instead of that fluid action-based battles that Tales fans love, Tempest offered a stripped-down version that just felt ugh. There was no depth. The combo system didn't exist, and navigating those menus was an experience. On a handheld system where quick and engaging combat should have been the focus, the game stumbled hard. It almost felt like Namco put the lowest amount of effort into Tales of the Tempest. And that's really the story of Tales of the Tempest. It was a game that wasn't ready, but was pushed out the door anyways. Fans criticized it heavily at launch, and even Bandai Namco seemed to recognize their mistake. Later entries on the DS, such as Innocence and Hearts, were much more polished, almost as if they were an apology to fans that actually played Tales of the Tempest. And while we're on the topic of this, I actually reviewed this game on the channel. Yeah, I suffered through this game to review it, so if you really want to see me roast it, that would be the perfect place to go. For passionate Tales fans, Tales of the Tempest is the shock of the series. It's proof that even the most reliable JRPG series can put out hot garbage, and sometimes a huge failure needs to occur just so that the series can shine later on. There was no saving this next one. Shining Resonance Refrain is a case of a franchise trying to reinvent itself, but completely losing its identity in the process. The Shining series once had a very strong legacy. Games like Shining Force and Shining Wisdom were considered classics, some saying Shining Force was one of the best strategy RPGs, even exceeding Fire Emblem, but by the time Resonance made its way to the West in 2018, felt less like a return of the franchise and more like a generic attempt to stay relevant. At first glance, it's very easy to see why people were hopeful. The visuals are clean and colorful, with an obvious anime-inspired style, and a very, interesting character designs. The story promises dragons, mystical powers, and a cast of young heroes. It's all very familiar, and every JRPG fan has experienced it once or twice before. But once you get past that initial presentation, it quickly becomes clear that Shining Resonance is one big playable cliche. The characters are all incredibly predictable. The dialogue does nothing to surprise you, and the story has been told 1,000 times before. The combat is also incredibly bland. It's action-based, but it's clunky and very boring. The Shining series has experimented with action before, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but the encounters in Shining Resonance become button mashy affairs where you just end up pressing the same button combination for 30 plus hours, and the game leans too heavily on the grind instead of actual challenge. It tries to offer that flashiness of more modern action RPGs, but it doesn't follow through. That world is hollow, exploration is limited, and environments feel very empty, and the side content is nothing but a waste of time. For a series that once stood shoulder to shoulder with games like Fire Emblem and Final Fantasy Tactics in terms of reputation, seeing it reduced to borderline depression is just sad. Shining Resonance Refrain is not broken, and it isn't unplayable, it's just painfully average. And sometimes mediocrity can be more disappointing than outright failure. And are you enjoying roasting these terrible games with me today? If so, why not hit that subscribe button and stick around for a while? There is lots more of these kind of videos planned for the future. Every once in a while, you come across a JRPG that isn't outright terrible, but somehow ends up being more disappointing than the other games that are. That's where Exist Archive: The Other Side of the Sky comes in. Released in 2015 from Tri-Ace, the studio behind juggernauts like Valkyrie Profile and Star Ocean. It had the kind of reputation that should have guaranteed at least a memorable experience. But instead of recapturing the magic of those earlier classics, Exist Archive feels like a shadow of better games. Valkyrie Profile is one of my favorite games of all time, so when I saw that Exist Archive shared a battle system and had the same style of dungeons, I was incredibly excited. This was another JRPG that I imported because I had such high hopes for it. Way to kill my excitement, Tri-Ace. Way to kill my excitement. The setup is intriguing at first. A group of young people die in a mysterious explosion and find themselves entangled with gods and immortality. It's a premise with the possibility of an amazing story, but the execution never rises above average. The story kind of exists and doesn't have that impact that Tri-Ace once delivered, and the characters, while serviceable, are about as deep as a kiddie pool. You keep waiting for those big emotional moments, but they never end up happening, leaving you feeling a little bit empty. Gameplay-wise, it borrows heavily from Valkyrie Profile. Side-scrolling dungeons, combo-driven battles, and character abilities tied to controller buttons. This is what got me incredibly excited. However, in practice, the dungeons are repetitive, the enemy variety is thin, and while the combat is functional, it doesn't evolve enough to stay engaging. It ends up feeling like a watered-down echo of Valkyrie Profile rather than a true successor. You can sense what they wanted to deliver, but the execution just doesn't have that same spark. And that's what makes Exist Archive frustrating. It isn't broken, it isn't laughably bad, and if you pick it up, you can probably play through it without hating the experience, but it's just average in the most boring sense of the word. It doesn't inspire the passion or nostalgia that Tri-Ace's earlier games managed to. Instead, it becomes one of those titles that you completely forget about the moment that it's over. Few names in JRPG history carry the kind of legacy that the Mana series does. Final Fantasy Adventure was amazing. Secret of Mana on the Super Nintendo was a defining experience for an entire generation. Trials of Mana had the beautiful visuals, unforgettable music, and that mix of action RPG combat and multiplayer co-op that felt way ahead of its time. Then enter Dawn of Mana. Released in 2006 on the PlayStation 2, it still stings so much to look back on. This was supposed to be the huge step forward for the series, a way to bring Mana into the 3D era. And instead, it ended up being one of the most widely criticized entries and worst games Square Enix has released to this day. At first glance, Dawn of Mana looks promising. The visuals are gorgeous. The environments, they have that whimsical Mana charm, and the soundtrack, as you expect, is amazing. But once you start actually playing, that is where the game falls apart. The game's central mechanic is physics-based combat, where you use your whip to grab and throw objects around the environment. In theory, it sounds great. It sounds like you're playing pinball, but it's an action RPG. But it ends up being clunky and frustrating. The controls never feel precise. It constantly feels like you're fighting the camera and gameplay systems. Combat becomes chaotic, but not in a fun way. But instead, in a sloppy and frustrating way. The level design doesn't help either. Instead of open fun worlds like in Secret of Mana, you're running through linear corridors filled with enemies that feel more like obstacles than meaningful encounters. I'll never forget trying to climb the tree in the cavern. It really should have only taken me an hour at most, but I spent several hours because I constantly fought with the platforming. Combine that with an unbalanced difficulty spike and awkward pacing, and what you get is a game that makes you want to turn your game into a literal frisbee. The worst part is that you can sense what the developers were trying to do. They wanted to innovate. They wanted to evolve the Mana formula for a new generation, but every bold idea just doesn't work out. Dawn of Mana isn't just a bad game, it's a game that damaged the reputation of a beloved franchise. It was released as part of the World of Mana project, which was supposed to revitalize the series with multiple titles across different platforms. Instead, it almost killed the entire franchise until we finally got Visions of Mana, which honestly is fantastic and everyone should play it. To this day, when fans talk about Mana, they remember the greatness that is Secret of Mana, but they rarely speak fondly of Dawn of Mana, and honestly, are you really surprised about that? Shining Force EXA. This was actually my first experience with the Shining franchise. If you were a longtime fan of the Shining series, this game felt like Sega walked into your house, threw your tactics manual in the garbage, and handed you a button-mashing anime brawler instead and told you, this is Shining, and you're gonna like it. For a franchise built on brilliant strategy RPGs, EXA was... well, it was definitely a choice. This game is just a generic action RPG, and has an incredible amount of button mashing. Forget tactical maps, forget positioning units. EXA asks you to mash your way through waves of monsters while the PS2 struggles to keep up with the frame rate. That frame rate was a mess, and it was as frustrating as the game itself at some points. But here's where the so bad it's good part kicks in. EXA throws subtlety out the window and doubles down on that flashy anime style. You've got your hot-blooded hero Toma screaming his way through hordes of enemies, and Cyril, the stoic mage, blasting spells like she's trying to one-up every shonen sidekick ever written. It's loud, it's messy, and honestly it's kind of hilarious. I guess that's where the charm of the game comes in, but it's not all bad. But it's not the best in the world. And then there's the Geo Fortress. The idea of upgrading and defending your walking giant fortress sounds amazing on paper. In execution, it was clunky, it was grindy, and kinda broke the pacing. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. Watching your base grow gave you a little hit of dopamine that almost made you forget that the game was barely holding together in combat. What saves EXA from being completely unplayable is its sheer commitment to nonsense. It's repetitive, sure, but there's something endearing about how hard it tries. The music by Hitoshi Sakimoto, yes, that is the very same composer from Final Fantasy Tactics. It makes the whole experience actually not suck. And when everything slows to a crawl in the middle of a battle, It somehow feels like the game screaming, "Look how epic this is," when in reality, it's just the PS2 begging not to crash. At the end of the day, EXA it's garbage with personality. It's the kind of game you almost can't recommend. But if you're the kind of player who enjoys digging through the trash for hidden treasures, you might find yourself laughing along with it. Is it a worthy Shining Force sequel? Oh god, no. But it is a weird broken anime action RPG? You'll remember it.
Why not make things easier for
If you've ever wanted top tier and wasted potential, why not take a look at Grandia III? This game is like heading to a 5-star restaurant and then realizing the entire kitchen staff was replaced with McDonald's employees. On the surface, Grandia III seems to be amazing. That intro is catchy. Yuki is interesting. His mom is hot, and the idea of being a pilot is kinda nice. It has the aspect of a great Grandia game. However, shortly into the game, that's where the whole thing starts to collapse on its hopes and dreams. A third of the way in, Yuki's mom just leaves. Gone. No explanation that makes sense. And she leaves with your new daddy. One of the most charming characters just vanishes. And what follows is a story so paper thin, it feels like the writers were making it up as they went along. It's almost like a Mad Lib. You have these flat villains that you never care for, cliche motivations that you've seen a million times before, and a save the world from evil generic plot that has none of the spark that made Grandia 1 feel so adventurous and Grandia 2 so beloved. However, the one thing Grandia 3 does have going for it is the combat system. The combat system in Grandia 3 is phenomenal. Maybe even one of the best turn-based combo systems of its era. Cancel mechanic, the ability to juggle enemies mid-combo, it's pure, brilliant design. Problem is, it's glued to a story that feels like a half-baked Saturday morning cartoon. Just not anywhere near as entertaining. The characters don't help either. After Yuki's mom bails, you're left with what might be the blandest JRPG party of the 2000s. Alfina, the main heroine, is supposed to carry the emotional weight of the plot, but she's just more bland than spaghetti noodles and butter. And the villains, I'd love to talk about them, but I don't remember a single thing about them. They're just so forgettable. Playing Grandia 3 is frustrating, because you can see that it could have been great. The world design is stunning. The music is solid. The battle system is borderline legendary. And yet the narrative collapses so hard that it just ruins the entire game. Yeah, I know I'm gonna hear a lot for this one. The Trails of Cold Steel series is a bit of a paradox. On one hand, it's beloved by many for its meticulous world building, intricate political intrigue, and the sheer care Falcom put into continuity over 4 massive games. Something the entire Trails franchise is known for. On the other hand, there's a strong argument that the series is bloated anime cliche at its core, stuffed with endless school events, ridiculous fan service, and dialogue dumps that test the patience of even dedicated JRPG fans. The first Cold Steel game was actually the first game that got me into the franchise, and it turned me into a fan, but after playing Sky and Crossbell, I realized how many shortcomings Cold Steel actually has. And if I had played Sky and Crossbell first, I don't think I would have been able to stomach all 4 Cold Steel games. So the main offender here is the protagonist, Rean Schwarzer. Sure, he's polite, earnest, and morally upright, and you would think that this would make him relatable, but over 4 games, he comes across as very, very bland. Rean often reacts to events around him instead of driving them, which makes it hard to invest in his journey. For players looking for a protagonist with personality, this is frustrating, because instead of a great protagonist like you got with Lloyd and Crossbell, or Estelle and Sky, you get this guy with the personality that rivals a cardboard box. And then there's the bloat. Each entry in the series is stuffed with hours of content, side quests, club activities, cutscenes, and dialogue that rarely advances the plot. Important story moments are often buried under mountains of school life filler and fanservice sequences, swimsuit events to awkward comedy moments that feel shoehorned in, which can make the pacing feel exhausting. By the 3rd or 4th game, the series has overstayed its welcome. This is a classic case of quantity over quality. The world is massive, the lore is rich, and the combat system is solid, but there's just too much at times. Sometimes I just want to get back to the main story. I get a lot of it is due to the world building, but seriously, why does Refrain have to reintroduce himself to every character in every single game? Surely once is enough. It just feels very fluff-filled. That said, it's important to balance criticism with fairness. Trails of Cold Steel does succeed in ways many modern JRPGs don't. The turn-based combat is thoughtful, the lore is meticulously constructed, and the moments of genuine emotional resonance do exist, especially when the story focuses on smaller character-driven beats rather than the sprawling political drama. The series has earned its fans because it delivers depth for those willing to invest the time. But if we're talking about why it lands on a list of worst JRPG experiences, it's largely because the pacing issues, excessive dialogue dumps, and over-reliance on fan service, and Reen's unremarkable character. They all combine to make it exhausting and occasionally tedious. The ambition is undeniable, but the execution often feels overwhelmed by its own scale, leaving you feeling worn out rather than thrilled. It's a JRPG that some will love to death, and others will remember as a marathon of anime tropes and dialogue bloat that just never hits its stride. And here we are. We're ending our list with the pinnacle of disappointments. No Kuni II, Revenant Kingdom. This is the kind of big name JRPG that demands attention. Developed with Studio Ghibli talent and sporting some of the most stunning visuals of the generation, it looked destined to be a modern classic. It had gorgeous hand-drawn environments, it had amazing music, and character designs that could have leapt straight from a fantasy painting. On the surface, it had everything. I loved the first Ni no Kuni. It was one of my favorite PS3 games. It had everything: an emotional story, gorgeous visuals, and a gameplay system that made me fall in love with everything the game had to offer. But that's precisely what makes Ni no Kuni II so painful to play. Beneath the beauty, the game is hollow. The story, while serviceable, is bland and is predictable, lacking the emotional resonance or narrative spark that made the first Ni no Kuni so memorable. The characters, including the young King Evan, are earnest, but they're very forgettable. You finish the main quest thinking that you've been through something epic, only to realize it never really landed and feels like it's missing something you can't put your finger on. Gameplay is equally underwhelming. Combat is simplistic and repetitive. The genius monster collecting turn-based system was replaced with an action RPG system, lacking depth for those who crave strategy or challenge. Meanwhile, the city building and kingdom management mechanics, meant to complement the story, are often far more engaging than the main quest itself. You find yourself pouring hours into resource management, trade, and upgrading your kingdom because that's where the fun actually is. Ironically, the feature that should have been secondary ends up being the main focus. And then there's the real-time strategy sections. Those were just so boring. And therein lies the biggest lesson of Ni no Kuni II. Graphics and presentation alone don't make a JRPG great. Studio Ghibli's involvement and the gorgeous score are enough to impress anyone scrolling through trailers or screenshots, but when it comes to the actual gameplay, they fall short. In the end, Ni no Kuni II serves as a reminder that graphics, while important, can't carry a game when it comes to the overall experience. And there you have it, 10 of the worst JRPGs ever made. But now I want to hear from you. Which JRPGs do you think deserve a spot on this list? Did I go too hard on any of these? Or not hard enough? Drop your picks in the comments and let's argue about it down below. Don't forget to like the video, hit that subscribe button, and ding that notification bell if you want to see more JRPG content. And before you leave, why not check out part 1 here? Because I actually did another video where I talk about 10 of the worst JRPGs ever created. That's one that you don't want to miss because there's some surprises in there. As always, this has been Chinky. Thanks so much for watching, and until next week's video, have a wonderful day.